Hi, today I'll be talking about experiences of US LGBTQ folks with online security, safety, and privacy advice. I'm Chris Geeng, and this was work done with Mike Harris, Elissa Redmiles, and Franziska Roesner. So queer and trans individuals face homophobic and transphobic harms when using digital tools. A recent GLAAD report found that 64% of LGBTQ social media users reported experiencing harassment and hate speech, a much higher rate than all other identity groups. And a couple years ago, a senior US Roman Catholic Church official was forced to resign after being outed through Grindr data sold to a third-party advertiser. So these harms lead to the question of where and how do queer individuals learn to protect themselves online? Previous research on computer security and privacy advice has largely focused on general populations and topics. But what about advice specific to preventing and mitigating queer and trans harms on the internet? This leads to the research questions for my project. 1. Where do queer individuals in the US find advice for supporting their online security, safety, and/or privacy? 2. What barriers prevent that advice from being effective? And 3, how do other identities impact finding and deciding on advice? Now I'll talk about our methodology. To answer our research questions, we conducted interviews with 14 queer individuals in the US in 2021. These were done by phone call or over Zoom due to the pandemic, and also to accommodate for folks who wanted more privacy. We recruited participants through posts in online queer communities, and we recruited until we reached saturation, or when no new major themes emerged from our interviews. The interview questions we asked included what security, privacy, and safety concerns people had as related to dating, sexting, and social media, particularly around their queer and other identities. We asked where people found advice, what kind of advice they gave others, and how they evaluated advice and whether or not to adopt it. We also had participants respond to advice prompts, which we collected from online documents targeting queer security and privacy. These document sources range from queer support organizations to platforms themselves like Tinder and Grindr, and product review sites. One example of an advice prompt that was common amongst guides was use a private account. We also took several ethical considerations with our study. It was approved by the University of Washington IRB. No video was recorded. Audio was deleted after we transcribed and anonymized interviews. And our interview practices followed trauma-informed best practices. We recruited diverse participants, diverse across gender, sexual orientation, age, race, and socioeconomic status. And it was important for us to recruit a diverse group because queer people's lives aren't only affected by gender and sexual orientation, but also by their race, class, and other identities. This concept, that many axes work together and influence each other, is called intersectionality. Finally, I want to acknowledge our position as researchers, since this influences the narratives of our results. Some authors identify as queer and non-binary, and others identify as straight and cis, and the authors are East Asian or white. Now I'll talk about our results. So our participants learned about security, safety, or privacy advice from vocation or school, searching on the internet, or from friends and family. And prior research has also documented these as sources for general security advice. What we also found was that participants often turned to their queer community for advice because they often had similar life experiences and concerns. For example, P4, who's gay and white, turned to his trans men support group for advice after he found a coworker on Grindr and realized they were accidentally added to each other. He said, "It wasn't like we had a leader, but we all just sort of compared notes about what we were doing." This let P4 hear different experiences so he could make a more informed decision. Another key finding was that participants found it important to get emotional and community support from a close connection, particularly after experiencing a harrowing event. For example, P12, who's lesbian and Black, talked about receiving emotional care and advice from a loved one after getting cyberbullied for posting LGBTQ topics on social media. Turning to my queer cousin was really beneficial. Yeah, I took the advice into consideration because I felt I had someone that really cared about me and that really accepted me for who I was. In our results, we also found many barriers to finding useful advice. These included distrust in the advice source, the advice becoming out of date, a sense of futility in adopting behaviors, the solution couldn't be found online or doesn't exist, not having the language for it, the advice would interfere with relationships, and the advice would interfere with income. I go into more detail on each of these in our paper, but today I'll just give an example about the last barrier. So related to advice would interfere with income, P8 runs a business on Instagram that was duplicated by a scammer. They didn't find make account private, the advice prompt, useful because they need their Instagram page to reach new customers. Which leads into another key finding, that participants' other identities also affected how they navigate safety. So some other identities that participants mentioned, aside from class and income, as related to their security thoughts and responses included transitioning, being an activist, being a parent, as well as race, age, and neurodivergence. To give an example of how race intersects with queerness, P10 gave a response to the advice prompt of use a police app during a date if one feels unsafe. Basically, this app allows someone to click one button in order to call the police to the phone's location. And he said that he wouldn't use this app because of his prior experience being racially profiled in a gay neighborhood. He said, the police started questioning me about where do I live? Am I homeless? This incident really ticked me off because I'm gay, the gay neighborhood. That's supposed to be my community. So this example shows how even amongst queer individuals, there are differences in experiences and impression based on other identities, and therefore differences in how useful advice would be. Now I'll get into takeaways from our results. So first, there is no one-size-fits-all security or privacy advice. While some behaviors were common amongst our participants and were discussed positively, like blocking people who are causing harm on social media, participants differed on other points, such as whether or not they'd make their social media accounts private or whether they would use a police app on a date. This also shows the usefulness of going to a support group for advice because people can explain what security behaviors worked for them in their specific contexts. We also have takeaways for advice sources. So first, communal learning can be effective. As the Reconfigure report wrote, cybersecurity is more effective when it is communal. Discussing online threats and mitigations with members of a community makes it easier and less intimidating to take action. We also note that advice sources in person should provide emotional support with advice. And also, advice documents should communicate credibility and provide explanations. We also have some takeaways for security research. First, intersectionality can be a useful analytical framework in usable security, particularly when researchers want to understand the most vulnerable communities in a specific context. And also, we note that security is not just a personal responsibility. Advice has limitations for what an individual can change. For example, an individual can't necessarily get rid of all the stigma in their culture, their communities, and their institutions. And this is why legislative and platform policy changes are needed to protect the queer community. And I go into examples on each of these in the paper. Just to conclude, in this project, we studied queer-specific online security, privacy, and safety advice through interviews with a diverse set of participants. And some of our key takeaways include that intersectional identities affect people's options for security, safety, and privacy behaviors. And also, security advice cannot be one size fits all. Thank you again to my collaborators for working on this with me, and also thank you for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions during the Q&A and also by email. Thanks.